Now that we have seen how do we execute the import and export statements with normal HTML files, now let's try to understand the syntax in detail. Let me remind you that to run import export with HTML and JavaScript only, you will need to configure a server, or if you upload on any live server, it will work. We have already seen in the previous section. So now let's proceed further with understanding the syntax. There are two ways of using export and import for a module in JavaScript. The first way is named export or import, and the second is the default export and import. In this section, we will go through the named export syntax. Alright, so now we have this index.html file, and I have already created a kelsey.js in which I'm going to define two modules. So I'll go to kelsey.js first. Let's say I have a function called sum which takes two parameters, very simple, and it returns a plus b. And let's also assume that you have one more function cube which is going to return cube of a number, so which will return eventually a into a into a. So now if I want that this kelsey.js file should export these two modules, that is the sum module and the cube module, then you can use the named export. Remember that there is one more keyword called default which we will see, that is the default export, but right now we are trying to understand the named export and import as well. So here what I'm going to do, I'll write export function sum. Similarly, if I want that this cube should also be exported, then I'll write export function cube. This means the kelsey.js has two modules, sum and cube, which is exported with the name called sum and cube. That's why it is the named export. I'll go back to index.html. Now let's say here I have some content of the page. I'm saying the page content or something. Important point here is I'm going to use the script tag and I will say module. Type is equal to module, that is. That means I'm going to import the module here. That's what we have seen in the previous section, where if you don't write this module, it won't work. Here I'm going to say import. Now, because the kelsey.js has a module called sum and cube, I can say sum. The named import will always have a curly bracket around the name. So here, when you import it, if you avoid curly brackets, it will give you error. If you have default import, then certainly you don't need those curly braces. But that's the next section. Right now, because we have the named export, we need to import with the curly brackets. Now you can certainly import the cube module in the next line with a next import statement. But that's also fine. You can just say that you want to import sum and cube, and you may have more modules also which you can separate by a comma, but here we have just two modules. So I'll say import sum comma cube from what is the file name and the path. So it is in the current folder, so I'll say // and the JavaScript file. So now the modules are imported. Next thing, either I can execute this sum and cube on some event, like I can put a button and I can execute this, but instead of that I'll straight away use the module code. So I'll say console log sum, which is taking two parameters. Next is cube, which is taking only one parameter. I'll say 3 here. I'll just save this. I'll go to the browser and I'm going to refresh this. Let me just correct this. Kelsey.js. Now I'm going to refresh this. You see that both the modules are executed the way we wanted. Again, I would like to remind you that I have configured the Chrome web server. That's why I am able to run the import and export. Locally, I have configured it. You can also try that. Or else you can upload these files on server and run it. Now, because this is a named import and export, you have different syntax as well. For example, you want to export these modules with a single line. For example, like this, I can say export. I can give a list of exports I want. So I'll say sum comma cube, that's what I want to export from this. Now here you may not have the export statement. What I mean to say is, in this particular file you may have many functions, but let's say from this file you just have to export only 2, maybe 5 functions as module, not that all modules you want to export. So you don't write export in front of all functions. So what you can do is, you may write export before specific functions in the file, or at the later stage at the bottom of the file you just give the list of modules you want to export. Let's save this. Let me also check here. Let me change the value so you get that there is a different output. I'll say 9,5. So now there will be a different output. Let's go back to the browser. Now again I'm going to refresh and it is working absolutely fine. So we tried one more way to export the module. There is also a choice whether you want to export a module with a specific name or not. Let's say inside this calc.js, this is a sum function, but when you want to export, you want to give the name total. So what you can do, you can say sum as total. Now if you do this, that means you will have to import it with the name total only. Let me just continue the current syntax and see what is the output. You see, it says that the calc.js does not provide an export named sum. So though the name of the function is sum, but you are exporting it with the name total. That means I'll have to change this name here as well. I'll say total, and the same goes to this particular line as well. Now if I run this, let me refresh. You see, it's running now. Now let me just change this back to sum, and here also I'll just say that I want to export the sum. Next thing is, when you import the named exports, you have a choice. Assume that you have multiple exports here. Now you have a situation where you want to import all the modules which are exported by calc.js. This is the syntax which you can use to import all the modules from a specific file. In that case, the modules which are imported will become part of obj, that is the object, and you can use the dot operator to access the members or exports of the module. Let's try that as well. We have already exported 2 modules from calc.js. So the thing is, I'm going to just say, let me remove this. I'll say star. That means I want everything to be imported. Star as, and here is the name. Let's say I want to give name calc only, or calculator, whatever you give, that's fine. I just say calc. That means calc becomes an object which will have this sum and cube as method of it. So now if I just save this and try to execute it, you will see that sum is not defined. In short, sum or cube is not accessible because the import is now under this calc hood. So now the next thing is, you will write calc.sum and calc.cube. Let me save this, go back to the browser and refresh. So we get the output here. The idea of importing all the modules like this is, when you have a file which contains many modules and all are to be imported, then you better use this. In case if you are using the modern build tools like Webpack, then it might happen that, let's say in this particular code, you have imported all the modules. Let's say you have imported sum and cube, but you do not use cube at any point of time. Then the modern build tools may remove the cube function from the imported library. So it's a kind of tree shaking happening. So you always make sure that if you are using all the modules, then this is a better syntax. But if you are not sure whether all the modules are to be used or not, better to go with individual named imports only. So let's change this code back to the standard way, that is, I'll say sum comma cube. Anyway, in this case, because we are using both the modules, the star as object syntax is equally applicable in this particular piece. The way we have exported with a specific name using as keyword, the same thing we can do with import as well. So I can say sum as total. So let the sum be exported from this calc.js file. Let it be like this. But when I import it, I want the name total. So now again, you will have to use total here. So the as keyword can be used with both import and export. Let's also remove this calc now because we don't need it. I'll just save and go back to the browser, and let me just refresh this. Now you see that even though the code is saying total, it is working fine. So these are the basic named import and export syntaxes. There are a few more things, but first of all, in the next section, we'll begin with default export and import, and then we'll try few more things in this section to deal with modules in more better way. Let's discuss the relative questions for this topic. The first question is, what is named export and import? We have already seen that we give a specific name to a module. Not only that, there is also multiple exports happening when you have named export. So when you have multiple exports per file, then you can use the named export. The next question is, can you avoid curly brackets while importing a named module? You cannot. The syntax while importing the named module is always use curly brackets. If you do not use, it won't work. So you have to have these curly brackets while importing the named modules. The next question is, how can you import all named modules from a file? Well, when you have to import all the modules together, you use the star sign and you use the as well, right? Here is the syntax. So this is how you import all the modules under one name, and then you use this obj as an object dot whatever members you have which are exported from a specific file. Those are available with this dot operator. So you can say obj dot the function name. Like in our case, we tried calc.sum or calc.cube. Next question is it a good practice to import all modules together? Well, as such, I have discussed this particular point about whether it is good practice or not, but here also I would like to rephrase all the things. The point here is, when you say import all, that is import star. Let's say you are using the sum function, but you are not using the cube function. With this particular JavaScript code, all the modules are imported. Now cube is not used and still it is imported, which is not good. So ideally, when you know that you have all the modules used in the application, certainly you can use this syntax. But in case if you know that only 2 or 3 modules are used at specific level, rest are used in some other file, then it's better to go with precise names to import the module. In the newer approaches where we have build tools, there might be unwanted modules removal internally happening. That is basically the tree shaking. But that doesn't happen when you are working without any build tool. You are just working with HTML, JavaScript, that is the core approach. Then you have to take care whether you need the module in that particular page or file or not. The next question is, do the modules hoist? Well, in ES6 as such, there is no hoisting. But for modules, yes, you do have hoisting. So you can have module like this which is used before the import statement is executed, and it is absolutely valid. So you do have hoisting with modules, though it doesn't make much sense as such, but as long as the behavior is concerned, it does happen. You ideally always import the modules on top of your code. You don't do it at a later stage. The next question is, do you need the same name while importing a named module, or you can change that name? Certainly you can do that. You can use the as keyword and you can change the name. We have already tried this. Even with export we tried this. So you can see this syntax where we have the as and we are changing the name.